know your name, I swear I do. It's on the tip of my tongue. Sorry, what did you say? I've known you for how long? Your face is so familiar, but no name comes to mind. Please, can you remind me if you'll be so kind? Staring out into space, asking God to hear my case. Trying to think of all things past. How long will my memory last?
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to Alzheimer Speaks Radio. I am your host and founder of Alzheimer Speaks, Lori LeBay. I am thrilled that you are with us, and hopefully your weather is a little better than what we're having here in Minnesota. We're going to get another 6 inches of snow, it sounds like, and I am so ready for spring, but I guess I will just have a much better appreciation for it when it does show up. For those of you that aren't familiar with Alzheimer Speaks, basically we got started because my mom had the disease for 30 years. And I just really felt as a daughter of a person living with dementia that we needed to connect more. We needed to get more resources. And so I started Alzheimer Speaks, which is an advocacy-based company providing multiple platforms to shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort around the world. And we also help companies expand their brand footprint by leveraging our content to increase access to products, services, and tools that so many people need when they are dealing with dementia. I also want to thank our audience for their loyalty and their time commitment to sharing our content with all their spheres of influence and friends, because collaboration, I truly believe, is the only way we're going to win this battle against dementia. And I know it's working thanks to each and every one of you. You see your likes, your clicks, your shares, in just all those little brief seconds it takes to do that. Got Alzheimer's Speaks recognized by Oprah as a health hero for 2018, by Maria Shriver as an architect of change, and by Dr. Oz as the #1 influencer online for Alzheimer's. And again, we did not do that alone. We did that together collaboratively as a team, sharing knowledge and working together to improve our dementia care culture around the world. I also want to invite each of you to think about being a guest on our show. We interview everybody here. From today, we are lucky enough to have a researcher with us, Dr. Elliot Goldstein, but we have people who are diagnosed with dementia, families caring for people, businesses that are providing products and services and tools. We've had authors and movie directors, a little bit of everybody. And so if you have a story to tell, reach out to me and let's get you scheduled. Let's get your voice heard, and share the knowledge that you have gained and the insights that you have. I also want to give a shout out. In March, I was in a few different locations. I was down with Health First down in Melbourne, Florida, and I just had a great conference down there for the Center for Family Caregivers. Just really put on a fantastic conference, and I so appreciated being part of that. I just got back from Washington, and there they had their Northwest Rural Health Conference, which was really interesting to hear what rural communities are doing to become dementia friendly. And I was also in Chesterton, Indiana, with the library system there, which was a very fun, and we did some screenings of His Neighbor Phil. In April, if you are in Iowa, I'm going to be in Altoona, Iowa, April 10th for the BrainWorks Conference with the Alzheimer's Association. And I'm really excited because I'm going to get to meet former Wisconsin Governor Martin Schreiber, and he has written a book about his wife and Alzheimer's called My Two Elaines. And I've had him on the show and interviewed him, but I'll finally get to meet him in person. And then James Hendricks, who is a PhD and director of the Global Science Initiative at the Alzheimer's Association is going to be there as a keynote along with myself. So again, that's April 10th. That's a Tuesday. And that's through the Alzheimer's Association. And you can just go to alzheimerspeaks.com and get some more information on that. Now, today's show, we're going to be talking with, like I said, Dr. Elliot Goldstein, who is with ProMIS Neuroscience. And he is going to be talking about a really highly awaited phase 3 clinical trial. And he's also going to talk about the challenges in Alzheimer's drug development. We've all heard, some of the failures, and he'll talk a little bit more with us about that. But prior to getting into that conversation, I just do have to do a couple of shout outs to some organizations that are dear to my heart. The Women's Alzheimer's Movement, which is Maria Shriver's, her Move for the Minds events are now on schedule, and you can go to the Women's Alzheimer's Movement.org to get more information on that. The American Senior Magazine, which is a lifestyle magazine for seniors with topics ranging from nostalgia to health and wellness, some great interviews and spotlights on notable older Americans. They have some games in there. It's large print. It's just really a nice magazine. And then the calendar card system, which is a memory system, also they have the directory for the Memory Cafe in the U.S. And so you can go to memorycafedirectory.com. That's memorycafedirectory.com, and you'll be able to see the free list of all the memory cafes in the U.S. And again, that is put on by Calendar Cards, which you might want to check out their memory system as well. And then the last one I want to give a shout out to, I'm really excited about this one, is called the Purple Table Reservations. And you can just go to purpletables.com to get more. But there is a gal who has put this together so that people can find kind of dementia-friendly environments when they go to a restaurant. And they're doing some training, and they've got an app, and they're just starting up. So if you know of restaurants that want to participate, please direct them to purpletables.com. So let me get back to our guest today. Again, we're going to be talking with Dr. Elliot Goldstein. And Elliot brings a really unique track record because he has dealt in the clinical regulations and the commercial development of new pharmaceuticals. He spent over 14 years on drug development all around the world, including being the head of clinical research and development here in the United States. He has also held positions as Senior Vice President of Strategic Product Development, Chief Operating Officer, and Chief Medical Officer, and also President and CMO in the pharma industry. So he's just extremely talented and well respected, and we are thrilled to have Dr. Elliot Goldstein with us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, before we get started on our track of questions, it's going to be more clinical related. I always like to do a little touchy-feely question first, and that is, Dr. Goldstein, have you been personally touched by family or friends with dementia?
Yes, absolutely. Like most of us, especially those baby boomers like myself. I mean, we're growing up in a generation where this really is the number one, medical challenge facing us. So I have a brother-in-law, interesting story, though. My wife is French, from France, and he's a police detective in Strasbourg, and was retired when he was 65 and diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 2 or 3 years later, and lived with the disease and, all the attendant issues, as many of your listeners know, for about 10, 12 years. And passed away when he was 78. And for me, you can read about the experience, and as a medical doctor, of course, understand it, but it's really not the same as actually living through it with a family member. And the impact on the whole entourage, not just the patient, of course, or the direct family members, but the extended family members was something I really had to learn about by seeing it personally. The impact on my wife was, quite devastating. She was very close to her older brother. So, yes, I've seen it, and, as the president and CEO of a company focused on neurodegenerative disease, but with our priority focused on Alzheimer's disease, I have conversations almost every day with potential investors, supporters of the company, but really they're just family members like myself, who have brothers, sisters, acquaintances, friends, favorite actor or whatever, whom they know, either directly or by their reputation. And it's very devastating for all of us. So, finding hope on the horizon is absolutely essential. And hopefully we'll talk about that today because there is hope on the horizon.
Yeah, there's been so many announcements lately of, failed trials and companies pulling out of the industry in terms of research. And so, the excitement has kind of changed to real anticipation and frustration of what's happening. Are we going to be moving forward with this? Because the need, I think, is becoming more and more prevalent to the public. People knew it existed before. I mean, even 5 years ago, the awareness of the devastation of this disease and the impact that it's having not only on families but on society at large and commercial business
right.
and our economics as a whole. It's getting a lot more attention. And so, I want you to talk a little bit about your company and what you guys are up to.
Sure, I'd be delighted to do that. Just as an introduction, though, before we talk about ProMIS Neurosciences, you did mention, a lot of the failures, and it's been a frustrating area. My experience in over 35 years of drug development had the wonderful opportunity, actually, to work in, areas of serious unmet need, in Parkinson's disease. I worked on the first new drug for transplant, cyclosporin, and now we're working on Alzheimer's disease, probably the area of the greatest unmet need in chronic disease today, ahead of cancers, which are being resolved, not completely, but to a good extent. So, in the pharmaceutical industry in general, we build bridges that collapse. Think if you were in an engineering company and 9 out of 10 bridges you built could never actually support traffic and work. Well, that's about how the rate of success in drug development for every product that enters the clinic, generally speaking, across all therapeutic areas, so there are some differences, but generally speaking, only 1 in 10 products that after years of preclinical research actually get to the clinic, only 1 in 10 or so actually make it to the market, and only 1 in 4 of those 1 in 10, so 1 in 40, are actually profitable. So what does that really mean in terms of decision-making and how the sort of ethos you need in the company? And then I'll get to talking about our company in a second. But it's really to learn from failure, to embrace it and understand why these bridges collapse, why there's so much difficulty. Obviously, if nature and medicine and pathology were that easy to dominate, it would have been done already. But in chronic degenerative diseases, that's not the case. So there has been a lot of failure, but we've learned. My experience in serious chronic diseases like autoimmune disorders, transplant research was another area, Parkinson's disease, I've mentioned those, and now Alzheimer's disease. My experience is it takes about 2 decades of, call it trial and error. It's a little more directed than trial and error, but, of testing, of failing, of learning from those failures, and eventually starting to see some positive results, which is happening now, and we'll talk about those later in the call, I would hope. We're starting to see the way forward, and certainly we've learned what not to do, what to avoid. So that's just sort of a general introduction on sort of how at least in our company and many others to approach failure and just the difficulty of discovering and developing new medicines. In the case of ProMIS Neurosciences, my business partner and I, Eugene Williams, he's the executive chairman. He's based in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm based in San Francisco. All of our research and development is done under worldwide exclusive license from the Brain Center at the University of British Columbia, one of the world's leading brain research centers, certainly one of the top 3 or 4 in my estimation. In any case, a few years ago in 2014, early 2015, my business partner, Gene Williams from Harvard, and we heard a gentleman who's now our chief scientific officer, Professor Neil Cashman, speak at a medical conference, and we were just absolutely stunned by the quality of the scientific approach he was taking. But here's sort of a lesson you learn already in especially in biotech. Smaller pharmaceutical companies. And the better the technology, the worse or the more demanding this problem is, and that's a little counterintuitive, but it's the following: it's the inability to focus. So we learned that the basic discovery technology that exists at the University of British Columbia and was developed by our now chief scientific officer, Professor Neil Cashman, can be applied to multiple neurodegenerative diseases, in particular Alzheimer's disease, which, as you know, accounts for about 80% of dementias. But also there's a host of other neurodegenerative diseases that all seem to have a common underlying mechanism, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the technology we have at the company that we've licensed under worldwide exclusive license from the University of British Columbia allows us to identify targets or sites on misfolded proteins. So these are proteins that are normal and natural in the body, in particular in the brain in this case. But when they misfold or take on an abnormal shape, they become toxic and kill neurons. So there's an underlying a common mechanism behind Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia or Lewy body disease, Parkinson's disease, repetitive head trauma. We now know, as stated by Eliezer Maslia, the new head of the National Institute of Aging, he stated this at a scientific conference in Boston last year, that there are multiple neurodegenerative diseases caused by misfolded forms of different proteins that have normal function. And that's what our company focuses on. Now, the reason why I said there's a bit of a blessing and a curse in this technology is because it can be applied to so many, I just listed half a dozen or so different serious, deadly neurodegenerative diseases. The company in the past was focusing across the board on all of them. And in biotech, that just doesn't work, because biotech, we're small companies in general, so we have less resource even than the large pharma companies, which means you have to exquisitely focus your technology on one area only and move to the next. Let me give you an example from daily life, okay?
Okay.
The technology we have could be used to identify drugs. We'll talk about how that works, but identify drugs for Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, etc., all these different serious neurodegenerative diseases. So why not work on all of them, because you don't have the resource? That's a little bit like deciding you're going to have 6 children right away. You're a young man, but you only have the money to support one. So how do you do that? Well, you've got multiple choices. You can starve all 6 of them, right? Give each child a little bit, sort of spread your resources, and then watch them all wither, quite frankly. Or choose the one that's the most promising, the brightest, or whatever your criteria are, and feed and support that one. But what about the other 5? Or what's the real answer? Don't have 6 in one shot. Have one first, nurture that one, take him or her through, whatever development needs, then go to the next one. That's exactly what you've got to do in drug development when you're a small company and you have a technology that's very powerful and can be applied to multiple disease states. So we chose very deliberately when we relaunched the company in 2015, and it's a bit of a long story, but I think it's important. When we relaunched the company on July 1st in 2015, we made the decision as managers to focus selectively and exclusively on Alzheimer's disease, the largest unmet need in chronic disease today in humans. So that's what we did, and that's allowed us in 2 years to go from basic research and ideas, the technology we have, to having a handful of exciting new products. The lead product, called PMN310, these are antibodies, is now moving forward to go into the clinic in 2019. But all because the technology is outstanding, but also we focused it on one unmet need, not half a dozen different diseases, which would have eaten up all our resources and not allowed us to progress. So that's just sort of a first thing about biotech and ProMIS. And part of my job, quite frankly, is to keep the research and development team relentlessly focused on this one objective, and that's knocking out a root cause of Alzheimer's disease. So perhaps, Lori, I can say a little bit of amyloid beta and what we've learned about it and why it's not a boogeyman but actually a great target. But we just need to know the right form. That's what we're specialized in. ProMIS, by the way, the name stands for protein misfolding. Okay. Proteins are ubiquitous. They're in the body. They do all sorts of things. They're enzymes. They hold our bodies together. It's structural proteins. And they kind of make everything work. And without them, there'd be no life. So we say protein. Most people think about proteins as sort of what they eat. Eating lots of protein is healthy. But there are so many different forms of proteins, and they're absolutely essential parts of the body in multiple respects. So that's just the first thing. When I say protein, that's what I'm talking about, not just alimentary, foods that you eat that are made up of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, right? So the original hypothesis about Alzheimer's disease, which arose in the late 80s, early 90s, and was sort of a follow-on from heart disease, was all about, at that time, atherosclerotic plaque, so plaque made up of lipids, fats, all those horrible things we're not supposed to eat. As you know, they can clog arteries and kind of just choke them, right, so the oxygen doesn't get through, and the organs that should be supplied by those arteries suffer. Well, it was thought also at the time that the plaque form of amyloid beta, and we'll talk about this, there's 3 different forms of amyloid beta, only one of which is toxic. That's what we've learned. But the plaque form is like a waxy, sticky substance, and on autopsies in individuals who've died with Alzheimer's disease, it's ubiquitous. You see a lot of it all over the place with heavy concentrations in areas where memory is, short-term memory is stored, like an area called the hippocampus, but you can find heavy deposits of plaque. So it was believed there was a very close relationship between also the development of Alzheimer's disease and the development of plaque. We now know that in about 25% of autopsies of individuals who died from anything but Alzheimer's disease, we also see significant amounts of plaque. But at the time, it was believed in the late 80s and 90s the plaque was somehow it's not inside the cells, it's outside the cells. And so it was kind of strangling, pressing down on the nerves and causing them to ultimately to die. Well, we now know that that's not really the case. Plaque is pretty well inert. In fact, potentially serves a positive function. So there's 3 forms of amyloid beta. That's what we've learned from the 20 years of so-called failed trials. Of the 3 forms, they are monomer, which is the single strand, like a string of pearls. And there's a form called oligomers. Monomers of amyloid beta is a very sticky protein, and when you put it in a Petri dish or in the lab, monomers, single strands, they'll start clumping together. They'll just stick together. And so you'll have 2, 3, 4, 10, 15 strands just kind of aggregated, stuck together in clumps. Those are called oligomers. Oligo just means more than one. So monomer, mono, one strand. Oligomer, more strands. All that's normal. And then those strands twist up and bunch together and aggregate and form plaque. Well, fibrils or fibrils, and fibrils make up plaque. And they're insoluble. They're sort of sticky like waxy, so they won't dissolve in liquid. Okay. The only form that's toxic, the oligomers, unfortunately have a tendency to misfold. This happens. All proteins can do this. Normally they're eliminated from the body, but if they misfold and they're not eliminated, then they start to spread through the brain like prions, and they destroy neurons and spread through the brain from areas of memory to other parts of the brain. On average, it takes about 15 years, we've learned. It's actually 17, according to the University of Washington, for these misfolded toxic oligomers to kill at least 10 billion of the 100 billion neurons you have in your brain, and then first symptoms occur, and that's called mild cognitive impairment. So really put simply, what we've learned is there's 3 forms of amyloid beta. Only one form is the bad actor. So if your product doesn't target selectively and specifically that bad toxic form, which I've called the misfolded oligomer, just to use a lot of fancy words, but if you don't target that form, your product's not going to work. If it targets plaque is relatively inert and not toxic. And in fact, products that have targeted plaque are associated with brain swelling, or it's called edema, which comes from breaking up the plaque. So targeting plaque's not a good idea, although most of the original products did, because it was believed that plaque was one of the drivers or root causes of the disease. We now know that that's not true. Other products targeted monomer. In the sense, if you could knock out all the monomer, which ultimately becomes oligomer, then maybe, you would do some saving there. That doesn't work as well. There's so much monomer in the brain that by having a product or drug that targets the monomer, we call it target distraction. You just fighting in the wrong neighborhood, if you like. So you need a product that products that target selectively and exclusively only these toxic misfolded forms. That's what our technology allows us to do. It allows us to identify sites or areas on the misfolded oligomers that we can attach an antibody to and knock it out. And that's what we do. It's so selective that those antibodies don't bind to plaque and don't bind to monomers. So all of the product is exclusively and selectively directed at the toxic disease-causing form or bad actor form of amyloid beta. And that's specifically what our company does, and our lead product, PMN 310, has passed all our criteria for selectivity, has all the right binding. It can block the toxicity of these toxic forms. It can block their spread in brain materials from Alzheimer's patients. So now we're in the process of initiating the manufacturing and scale up and all that you have to do to get into the clinic, and we anticipate having our first clinical trials in 2019.
Okay. So with your clinical trials in 2019, and I mean that's going to be here before we know it. The way I
right.
Still can hear my mom saying, the older you get, the faster the time goes, and I sure am feeling that. Since we're in April already of 2018, I just can't believe it. Do you know in terms of who you're going to be targeting? Because a lot of times I'm out in the field, talking with people all the time, and they say a lot of times it's it isn't their demographic specifically. Have you guys determined who your demographic is going to be for your trial?
Yes. We still have to translate that into very specific scientific terms and discuss with the regulators. But I think most experts in the field and in chronic diseases in general, you really want to address your patients as early as possible. So we wanted to initially recruit patients with, who are in the early phase of Alzheimer's disease, where, we've got mild cognitive impairment, if you like, but still relatively good function. So yes, we would be looking at early stage. Now, there's one other group of also symptomatic Alzheimer's patients that we'll be addressing in a different set of trials. I just thought I'd mention it, though, not patients with trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. Now, as you may know, and some of your listeners may know, these individuals, completely aside from the mental retardation, that goes with trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, they develop a very early onset Alzheimer's symptomatology that progresses rapidly. You can even diagnose some patients in their teens, and by the age 60, 65, over 3/4 have full-blown Alzheimer's disease. And the reason behind that, which is further support for addressing amyloid beta as a target, is they have, Down syndrome is trisomy 21. Those patients have 3 copies, or those subjects, I should say, those people have 3 copies of chromosome 21. Normally we have 2 copies of every chromosome. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. They have an extra chromosome 21. Well, guess what gene codes on chromosome 21? The gene for amyloid precursor protein. That's the gene that actually allows to create amyloid. They've got an extra copy of the gene, i.e. from birth, they're born with massive amounts of amyloid beta in the brain, so just have a much greater propensity for their oligomers of amyloid beta to misfold and kill neurons. So that's a separate group, but it's exactly the same pathology, if you like, as Alzheimer's disease, because of the destruction caused by these toxic forms of amyloid beta. But for what I'll call standard Alzheimer's disease, not in the Down syndrome, we'll be going for early early patients. Now, not early onset, patients who have early forms of the disease, right, who aren't too advanced.
Okay, great. Well, that's exciting on the Down syndrome side too. I have worked with a lot of companies who deal specifically with that. In fact, I used to be in that industry before I landed in this space and before I was in real estate for 25 years. So I kind of started out in healthcare there, still have a lot of connections. And that's a common conversation with people. So that'll be, both of those targets will be wonderful. Wonderful to see.
Now, no, absolutely. And I just mention it because not many people are aware, people who aren't, familiar with trisomy 21 or Alzheimer's disease aren't really aware that you can have similar symptomatology. But that was the reason. It's a genetic reason. Now, you mentioned early on that I was going to say something about positive phase 3 data and the learnings from all the past trials. And why are we so optimistically excited about the future? Well, up until now, all of the drugs targeting beta amyloid, mainly plaque, have failed except for one. So we're going to talk about that one, which really gives us hope. When you look back at the profiles of these different drugs, from what I said earlier on, your listeners could tell me, well, if your drug targeted only plaque, would it work? No, it can't, because plaque is not killing neurons. We now know that. Well, what if your drug targeted only monomer, the single-stranded form of amyloid beta? Some of the products only do that, like a drug called solanezumab from Lilly. It failed in three repeated trials in phase 3. It had a mild effect, but it was never enough, and that's because it's impossible to knock out all the monomer so it doesn't misfold and become toxic. So what's the one drug that actually is really offering hope? It's a product called aducanumab. Almost all these products end with the word MAB, by the way. MAB stands for monoclonal antibodies. They're antibodies. Not MAD, but MAB, M-A-B is in Boris, this monoclonal antibody, which means an antibody specifically directed against something. That's all. So aducanumab targets two forms of amyloid beta, hence its apparent success, but also one of its issues. It targets plaque, which we now know we don't want to do, or we don't want to do certainly as a major effect. But it also targets these toxic misfolded forms, what I call the toxic oligomers. That's why it works. Now, it's the only product ever in drug development in Alzheimer's disease to have shown a maintenance of an effect, slowing or stopping cognitive decline in early and mild cognitive impairment patients for 3 years. I'll just repeat that again. They have 3 years of follow-up now. And the patients who are on the highest dose of the product, which is about 10 milligrams per kilogram, all antibodies are always given as infusions, intravenous 30-minute 1 to 1 hour infusion. That's the way you have to give antibodies, because you can't take them orally because they'll be destroyed in the digestive system. Given about once a month at a dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, they've been able to show with Biogen's aducanumab that patients, either their cognitive decline, loss of cognitive function, in particular memory function as measured by all the various tests, that have become standard, is they've either been able to stop the decline or slow it very significantly compared to lower doses or placebo. So that's the good news. Now there's 2 large phase 3 trials running with Biogen's aducanumab. Biogen's a neuroscience company based in the Boston area and widely respected in the industry and in the expert community as a top-notch neurology company. They've brought tremendous development to the area of multiple sclerosis, for example. They've just done a brilliant job in that area and are now focusing on Alzheimer's disease. Anyway, aducanumab, with 3 years of follow-up, been able to maintain the slowing or stopping of cognitive decline. This has never been seen before. So 2 large phase 3 trials are ongoing. My understanding, I can't speak for the company, of course, because I'm CEO of a different company, but, very much, laudatory about Biogen. We understand that their trials will be finished and the results will be available around mid-2020. Maybe second quarter, something like that. So that program could be approved early 2021, for example. It's the first drug on the market that actually deals with the underlying cause. Now, here's the problem and why we think we'll have an advantage over aducanumab, which we'd love to see come to market because it's absolutely needed. And for those patients who respond to the treatment, there's nothing that performs like that so far. So that's the good news. Now, I mentioned the product targets not only this toxic misfolded form, these toxic oligomers, which you want to target, but also targets plaque. That's its problem. All products that have been in drug development and that has failed or, where the testing has been stopped, all of those that target plaque, bust up plaque, if you like, are associated or have been associated with brain swelling. It's called neurovascular edema. It's also called area E because you can see it on PET scans. Anyway, it's a sort of swelling. And edema is just the leakage of fluid out of blood vessels into the surrounding tissue. That's what edema is. Now, it's not a deadly side effect, but it occurred in about 35 to 55% of the patients in the aducanumab trials, depending on their genetic profile and other factors. But just say 30 to 50% presented this, depending what subgroup they were in. Now, what has to be done is when patients present this side effect or adverse event is they have to be backed off the dose, or either taken off the drug or back down to a lower dose, in which case they lose the efficacy. So that's the challenge with this product. But in those patients who can take it, who don't develop the neurovascular edema, the brain swelling, and there are some methods to sort of reduce that, build the doses up slowly so the tolerability is better, and that's worked to some extent in the clinical trials, so it's manageable but not for everybody. But one could imagine that, 40-50% of patients with the proper diagnosis of early Alzheimer's disease could benefit from this product. Now, we've engineered our product, our monoclonal antibody called PMN310, it's just the code name, so that it targets exclusively and only these toxic misfolded oligomers, not the plaque and not the monomer. So one is we should be able to get up to much higher doses because the brain swelling or neurovascular edema is a dose-limiting side effect of aducanumab. You can't give more than 10 milligrams per kilogram body weight because then the side effect starts occurring at that dose. So that's the top dose. And as I mentioned, a third to half the patients can't take it because of the side effect. But again, those who can, the results are frankly quite stunning and have never been seen before. So we now, we've learned from all the failures and the half a dozen or so, billions of dollars spent to get back to the bigger picture, that the key, if you're working, to remove toxic amyloid beta, is make sure your product doesn't target monomer. It's just targets a waste. It's just normal and neutral, and you don't get any effect from that. Don't target plaque because it's also not toxic and you can actually have side effects. Target selectively and exclusively the toxic form. A bit like hunting out a gang member in your neighborhood, Just think about it. If you could go in and blow up the whole neighborhood, you'll get the bad guy or bad girl or bad person, but you'll have all this collateral damage. You need a way to go in and find out, well, what identifies this toxic gang member? Will they wear a red bandana or have a tattoo that's so selective? Well, we find the tattoo, if you like, on the toxic misfolded forms of amyloid beta, and we make antibodies against only that form. So we don't knock out the whole neighborhood. We don't hit any of the good guys in the neighborhood, if I can use that expression, but selectively and specifically only knock out the bad guy. And relatively speaking, there are very few of these toxic oligomers or toxic forms in the brain compared to the massive amounts of monomer and plaque. So you've got to go in extremely selectively. If not, you'll have no chance of having an effect. But that's taken 15 to 20 years of clinical research with various antibodies from different major pharmaceutical companies to have learned that, because they all had very, slightly different profiles, targeting one of the forms and not the other and this sort of thing. And now we've learned that it's really this one misfolded form. And we've also learned that in other diseases like Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia, it's a misfolded toxic form of a protein called alpha-synuclein. It's a different protein than amyloid beta. It tracks into different parts of the brain, but in this case, it leads to Parkinson's disease. Misfolded toxic aggregated forms of a protein called tau lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the terrible dementia that comes from repetitive head injury, like from, head injuries in football, for example. Another, I'll just go to the last one, you can see there's quite a common sort of bad pathology going on in the brain, is a protein called TDP43, a big mouthful that stands for target DNA binding protein. Doesn't mean it's a different protein again. So I talked about alpha-synuclein for Parkinson's disease. We talked about amyloid beta, misfolded toxic forms for Alzheimer's disease. We talked about misfolded forms of a protein, aggregated misfolded forms of tau, leading to chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And let's just go to the last bad actor in the brain. It's just this TDP43, when it misfolds and aggregates both inside and outside cells, causes a different dementia called frontotemporal dementia, and also seems to be one of the root drivers of ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Now, why it's important to mention this is because it would seem that there are multiple diseases, chronic, deadly neurodegenerative diseases related to toxic misfolded proteins spreading throughout the brain. They spread like prions, so that's really important, and it just means that this sort of, if you take the cancer example, cancer cells, if you like, are basically cells that escape normal control over growth and division, right? Different cells, different gene types cause different cancers, but the fundamental bad event, if you like, is this escaping of control. Well, the fundamental bad event in these neurodegenerative diseases I mentioned is a protein, a normal protein that misfolds, becomes toxic because it's not normal, it's misfolded, and it starts to propagate through the brain. And there's, different proteins causing different diseases. So we do actually have our discovery platform allows us to address all of these diseases, because as I said before, right now we're focusing exclusively on Alzheimer's because it's the area of biggest unmet need and, the largest societal impact you could imagine, both in terms of behavior but also, economy and just the health of our healthcare systems, if you like. So that's the long story that's taken 20 years, and we've been able to benefit from all this learning and apply it now extremely selectively.
Wow, I learned a lot today on this, and it does sound very, very promising. And I think so many people are going to be excited too with MCI that they're going to want to be part of the trial if possible. So let me ask you this with you, because this will be a question I know people will be asking me.
Sure.
With your trial, is it going to be limited to a certain area, or is it something that people can participate in around the country? How will that work?
Yeah. Well, it's early days to go into great detail because, as you know, the first trial is basically a safety trial, right? In patients. I'll do all of our trials in patients in Alzheimer's disease. It's the way to do it. So the first trial would be a safety trial where we would give a single dose, and then it's called a single ascending dose. You increase the doses to see how well tolerated it is, and then you go to you give multiple doses and do something very similar. We'll be meeting with regulatory authorities. There's actually 3 territories we're looking at. And again, it's to take you inside our thing. Today, especially in large unmet need areas where there are a lot of patients, right, but also a lot of competition for clinical trials like Alzheimer's disease, almost all the trials have to be large multi-center trials and often multinational as well. So the good news for individuals who would participate, you could imagine that especially when we're doing our phase 2 trials in larger patient numbers of patients, they would be in multiple centers in North America and Europe most likely. Right now we're looking at our first trial, our 2019 work, which is, I guess, what people are most interested in. We are looking to see, we're looking at sites potentially in the United States in several cities. I can't name the sites right now. We're just looking into it in Canada and most probably England, the United Kingdom. Those would be our 3 top territories for regulatory reasons and historical reasons and, sort of things you learn about drug development, where to do it. But definitely we'll have a large presence in North America and Europe as well. So I think there'd be a good chance, that there would be availability for some of your listeners in various cities. And, of course, we'll communicate very openly and clearly, as we progress towards the clinic and have the manufacturing and other pieces in place. We'll talk publicly a lot more in detail about, where the trials will be and how to eventually get into a trial or at least try and register and all that. Trial recruitment is very important, and both for the patients and their families, of course, but also for ourselves. So it's something we'll pay special attention to.
Wonderful. Well, that's very exciting. We will definitely have our ear to the ground, and if you can make sure that you notify me when that time comes, because people are, I think, and maybe it's kind of that give and take, with the failure and the pullout of certain drug companies. I think people are really reanalyzing a little bit more of, oh my gosh, we need these. I didn't know that they needed me, but we need them. And I think it's being looked at a little bit differently now. And so I'm hoping that more people will choose to get involved in the trials, understanding, you can't just assume someone else is going to do this work. You've got to, everybody has to partake in this. If we're going to really get to the crux of it, we need a lot of assistance with that.
Yeah, having been, managing clinical trials across multiple therapeutic areas, but generally chronic diseases, as we've mentioned, for, 30 plus years, there's one of the things that's really important, I'm sure many of your listeners understand it, but getting into clinical trial is not just about, getting potentially some new exciting drug, because you can also potentially be getting a low dose of it or a placebo or whatever. But most importantly, at first, is, you get expert diagnosis and state-of-the-art care. And so that's really important as well, and something, that's really important to encourage the listeners to do, even not in the context of a clinical trial. Now, my specialty is I'm an endocrinologist, but pituitary disease, neuroendocrinology is what I studied in my specialty training. And it's important to note that although 80% of dementias and cognitive disturbances of that type, approximately 80%, are Alzheimer's disease, there are many or several that aren't. Some of which that are treatable, certain endocrine disorders, certain psychiatric disorders, as I'm sure you and your listeners have discussed before. So getting into a clinical trial really affords that sort of expert review and diagnosis. And so actually being reviewed for the clinical trial sometimes could be a positive thing if there's, a treatment available for non-Alzheimer's syndrome that may look like Alzheimer's disease. So I think we really encourage listeners who have any doubt or concern to consult with, a center in their area, if possible, that's really well known for this. Centers that run clinical trials really have to be expert at diagnosis, because obviously the idea is you want to include patients who have the disease you're studying and exclude patients, who have a differential diagnosis who don't have Alzheimer's disease. So I would encourage any listeners to make sure they're up to date for themselves or their family members in seeing an expert center, potentially to get into a clinical trial, but even upstream of that, they get really excellent diagnosis and, state-of-the-art therapy, because that's what occurs in a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. So that's my sort of one message to everybody, just as a physician.
Sure. Well, and, at Alzheimer Speaks, we've worked with some other trial companies in the past in terms of helping them market and stuff, because we have, the multiple platforms with a quite a large reach. And, I'd be more than glad to talk with you on that too offline if that would help. Now, do you foresee, in cancer patients, they kind of have these cocktail treatments, it's like, well, we're going to tweak this a little bit, for you, and, well, that didn't quite do it, so we're going to tweak it a little that way. Do you see that happening with medications in the future for dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. Not so much tweaking, but let's just sort of think about the disease. Well, we know it takes about, you need to lose about 10 billion neurons of your 100 billion before you get any clinical symptoms. Well, what does that demonstrate, as you and your readers know, or listeners know, the great plasticity of the central nervous system or the brain. By plasticity, this is ability to adapt as parts of it are dying or disappearing, as it's losing cells. It is rather flexible and plastic is the word we use, which wasn't really believed very much about, 30 or 40 years ago. It was thought you have had the nerve cells you got, and then you lose them, that was it. But we know the brain's very plastic. But what that really means is, as the disease is developing, you have certain compensatory factors that are coming into play. Inflammation, for example, is a natural physiological response to certain types of insults or injuries or aggressions. So you have sort of a low-grade inflammation and other adaptations going on while the disease is progressing. So that's one thing. So you want to be able to get those back to normal, right? So that's sort of one set of therapeutics you would need. Now, that's not the underlying disease. There you're sort of addressing the normal changes that the brain has had to do to adapt and try and sort of stay with it, if you like, for at least 10 billion neurons. And then, then you start seeing symptoms. So there's a set of symptomatologies that could make sense. Second one is the current therapies on the market today, like Exelon and Memantine and others that are in development, called neurotransmission enhancers. Basically, if you think about your neurons like bridges all connecting up in your brain, but there's billions of them, well, neurotransmission enhancers push more traffic across the bridge. Right? That's what they do. Mm-hmm. Now, the traffic on our neurons is either electrical or chemical. And so that's another approach. However, if you think using my bridge analogy, the first thing you really want to do is stop the collapsing of the bridge, stop the dying of the neurons, then push more traffic across by like repaving the bridges, right? But some point in pushing more traffic through a bridge that's collapsing. I mean, yes, you get 6, 9, 12 months of some symptomatic help, and that's a valuable and useful thing, as you and your listeners know, but it's very temporary and doesn't affect the underlying disease. So wouldn't the first thing to do be stabilize the bridges, stop them from collapsing, right? Then push more traffic across, and also take care of some of these things that have developed over time as your brain sort of tried to fight it off as best it can and did a pretty good job for quite a while, i.e. anti-inflammatories and other drugs like that. So that would give me a cocktail of a principal disease-modifying medicine to stop the neuronal death, the dying and killing of neurons, which would be what aducanumab is doing from Biogen and what we're purporting to do, and hopefully is a best-in-class drug, is knock out, incapacitate these toxic neurons, these toxic oligomers of amyloid beta that are killing neurons. In addition, add in, when and where appropriate, an enhancer that can push a bit more traffic through the neurons, i.e. can help the neurotransmission, and then add around that some anti-inflammatory or other drugs that could really, help reduce some of the inflammation and other aspects that have developed while the body's been trying to combat this disease. That would be sort of my prototypical 3-drug cocktail. But you've got to stop the bridges from collapsing first, save the neurons, and then help them, But so you're absolutely right. I know of very few chronic diseases, unless it's like a disease where you're missing a specific enzyme and you replace it. And even then, often there's been so much adaptation from the body, like in diabetes. You replace insulin, but you have so many other problems going on. So yeah, a cocktail approach with a fundamental disease-modifying drug and then these other aspects that I mentioned, probably, or some combination of that, obviously tailored to the individual patient, seems the way things would be going.
Okay. Well, very interesting. Now, the best place for people to get more information on your work would be ProMISNeurosciences.com, and ProMIS, drop the E at the end, so it's PROMIS, and then neurosciences.com. And you have some videos and things on there and some presentations. I mean, there's a lot of information that people can glean off your site in terms of what you're doing and so forth. Anything else that you want to plug? We've got about 5 minutes left here.
Well, just a couple of things I'd like to say. One, just specifically about our website and our company. I think that's a great place to go. There's a magic whiteboard presentation there that's about 1.5 minutes. The whiteboard is you have this hand drawing very fast on the whiteboard and the text. That goes over the 3 types of amyloid beta I talked about and the root cause being the toxic misfolded form. That's just a nice place to start to re-anchor that thought. And that's really sort of what's special about what we do and what the field is doing now is highly selective targeting of the right thing. And it's taken, as I said, 15, 20 years and a few $1 billion of failed trials and partially successful trials and what looks like a success now with aducanumab to finally learn all of that. So that's one of my first message to all of us is we've got to learn from the past and be open-minded, and that's the drug development process. It really is. Learning from, actually, one of the issues is a lot of the animal models of Alzheimer's disease that were developed, they were developed as plaque models. So, but now that we know that plaque's not really the underlying driver, so what you learn from those models is not very much. Where we've really learned it from the human trials, which obviously humans, I don't want to say humans are models, but the human animal is obviously the best place to study human disease and, potential drugs that can affect it. So that's another important learning is that, animal models are not very predictive in this case because they were based on a hypothesis that was incorrect or only partially correct. So that's important finding as well. The last point I would like to point out, though, is that I really hope on the horizon. We're very excited as people in the field, like many others, about aducanumab, Biogen's drug, which I mentioned. We should be seeing their phase 3 results in 2020. We believe it's got a very good chance, others as well, other experts believe it's got a very good chance of approval and coming to market. So that's great. That's real hope on the horizon in the near term. And we believe with our approach entering the clinic in 2019, we can follow on with a program that, if you like, addresses the 1 weak point of aducanumab, the side effect because it's related to busting, targeting plaque, and go up to much higher doses and have even greater effectiveness. And finally, to conclude, that the most important thing is to get to a qualified center early for proper diagnosis and treatment. I'm sure, and I know you've had other programs and discussions about the things you can do that are important, whether or not you have drugs that are effective or you're in a clinical trial. We know there are a lot of things that can help sustain good mental health, and certainly a number of things that, if you don't do them, are really deleterious, like withdrawing from company, not being socially active, not being engaged. There are a lot of things that are obviously easy to say but hard to do, but nevertheless essential for good mental health. So I'd say if we put all of that together, we at ProMIS really see hope on the horizon, and we want to be part of the solution, and we think we're on track to do that. And I close with those comments, if you'll allow me.
Oh, that is wonderful. I so appreciate your time today. This hour just blew by so fast. It always does.
It did.
Yep. I love to learn, and you spoke in everyday language, so it was easy for us. Sometimes I'll have researchers on, and it's hard to understand exactly what they're saying, but you used a lot of metaphors and explaining things, and it was very, very helpful. So again, I appreciate all the work that you and ProMIS are doing, and we wish you the greatest success, and we really appreciate your attitude that failure is just really one step closer to success too. I think that's something that we all need to adapt to in all of our lives. We have to reframe, what is failure and why is it important to us, and how can we use it to our advantage. And it sounds like you guys really have that at your heart, understanding the benefits of failure. Again, it's not the end goal, but it's not a wash either. There are great lessons to be learned to be able to move forward with that. So thank you again, Dr. Goldstein, for all of your time with us today. We do appreciate it. And please keep us posted as that trial gets put together. We would love to talk with you further about helping you be able to push that out to have as great of success as possible. Because we need you guys.
Well, thank you.
I
very much look forward to that, and staying in touch with you and your listeners, with some updates. So thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. In closing, I'm going to shout out to a couple other companies here. For those of you who are a little bit nervous about maybe having a loved one or a client who might wander, you might want to check into the Call Alert Center. They have one specifically for dementia. But you also, if you have children or pets or college students or just travel, the Call Alert Center can help you stay protected just in case that incident would happen where someone would go missing. And if you go to alzheimerspeaks.com on our homepage, you'll get a discount of 20% when you sign up for that. And it's under like $15 a year, but it's just one of those things that helps you prepare. Same with the Roberto app, which measures brain function through video engagement. It's really a cool tool to be able to use. Again, go to alzheimerspeaks.com on our homepage, and you'll get information regarding that as well. And the last two I want to shout out to is the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation. If you're looking for a holistic mode, that's a great route to go. Check out, I'll just go to alzheimersprevention.org. And then the last is the Care to Plan Dementia Resource Directory, which is in beta testing. And again, if you go to alzheimerspeaks.com and go to our resource tab, you'll find more information out on that as well. Have a blessed week, and we'll talk with you all soon. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And don't forget to click and share and like and help us spread the word. Bye now.
It's time to rethink, renew, and reimagine retirement. Hey everybody, Jared Sylvester here, host of Retire Repurposed. Now this podcast is about the non-financial parts of retirement, which many times can be even more challenging than the financial. We believe retirement is not the end, rather the beginning of what could be the most impactful, purposeful, and fulfilling season of a person's life. So don't retire, become repurposed. To listen now, search Retire Repurposed on your favorite podcast platform, Senior Resource, or Life Audio.